Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Pop Culture Double Date. This week we're back and we are going to talk about Crazy Rich Asians, which was a film that opened in Australia. I don't know if it's opened yet actually, but we went to see it last weekend, and tonight we're just going to share our thoughts on it. I'm joined tonight by Anaja, Gerald and Maggie, as usual. Say hello everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
And as usual, this is going to be a full spoilers podcast, so if you don't want to listen to spoilers, turn it off now. But if you want to listen to spoilers, then keep listening, because we're interesting, I hope. Okay, so, I think Crazy Rich Asians is a really interesting film for us to talk about, because obviously, around this table, pretty much all of us hit at least one, maybe 1.5 of those those descriptors in the film's title, and I think I think it's not the rich, because none of us clearly had weddings where we went to international waters to celebrate a
But
bus.
2 out of 3 ain't bad, as Meatloaf would say.
I think we're missing the most important one. From seeing this film, I think we're missing the most important one. But anyway. Yeah, so, let's start by just, actually, before we start, I think, we'll kind of, break the podcast into, 2 little bits. I think let's start just basically talking about the film and what we thought about the film as a film. And then I thought it actually would be interesting to have a bit of a conversation about, given that, everyone around the table is basically of some sort of Asian ethnicity, whether we thought there was any resonance in the film, whether we could identify with any aspects of the film, and just kind of talk about how, the whole sort of, the film kind of deals with, I guess, Asians generally, right? So let's start with the meat and potatoes of the podcast, though. Let's just go around the table and have a chat about what we thought about the film. Now, I know Mags has actually read the book. I don't know, who else has actually read the book of Crazy Rich Asians? No one else. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so, I might give everyone all our listeners, a really quick rundown of what the film is actually about. I mean, the film at its heart is actually a very simple sort of romantic comedy about basically a guy bringing his girlfriend to meet his family. I mean, pretty classic romantic comedy fare, and the hijinks that ensue. I think the point of interest about the film is kind of in the title, which is that, the guy's family are a bunch of really rich Singaporeans, outrageously rich Singaporeans, right? So, I mean, that's really the film's premise. So, who wants to start? Andrew, Jerry, Mags?
Yeah, look, I think when it first started, I wasn't sure, because it starts off as your very typical, almost B-grade romantic comedy. For me, about 95% plus of romantic comedies are B-grade. It's one of my least favorite kind of movie genres, and it was starting off as just the same way, and I started to think, I really want to love this movie, and if I'm honest with myself, and this was a bunch of white actors acting the same plot, would I be even remotely interested or bored right now? So I was a little bit worried with how it sort of started off with those familiar tropes, but it really did bring in the emotional angle, and it really did delve deep into some more, themes and sort of story developments that I could really connect with. And I have to say, it's definitely one of my top 3 romantic comedy movies that I think I've ever seen, and I really enjoyed it by the end.
Wow, that is high praise from Anaja. Okay. Jerry, do you want to shoot next? And then we can have a chat with Mags about what she thought about it relative to the book.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I thought this was a movie of incredible charm. I think from my perspective, it's actually hard to separate the merits of the film from the resonances of it as a consequence of the fact that it is the first predominantly Asian American film set in contemporary times that we've had since The Joy Luck Club, which was about 25 years ago. But notwithstanding that, doing my best to judge the film as a film. It was an extremely charming movie, and it had a very charming cast. I mean, Constance Wu, we know from her role as Jessica Huang on Fresh Off the Boat, and she demonstrates here an ability to carry off the lead romantic role almost effortlessly. And she's such a refreshing presence, and really does sort of light up the screen when she's on it, and she's surrounded by a formidable cast of players, not least of whom is Michelle Yeoh. I mean, Michelle Yeoh is better known for action movies. She was famously perhaps the only Bond girl to be a better action hero than James Bond himself in Tomorrow Never Dies. And in this movie, she is playing, very subtly with just glances or facial expressions, a character who's so vivid and so formidable that it's incredible to think that this star of Hong Kong action cinema could pull off this sort of performance. And dare I say that the film is beautiful to look at. John M. Chu obviously has a great visual style when it comes to filmmaking, and what he creates is this sort of sumptuous delight. So it's not a perfect film, if only because it hews a bit too closely to romantic comedy tropes, not least of which is the chase at the end and the confrontation at the airport or on the plane in this case, in a final scene that, or rather second last scene, which kind of brings to mind Ross chasing Rachel at the end of season 2 of Friends. But putting all that aside, I thought it was it's a really good time in the movies.
Mags?
Well, I really enjoyed the movie, actually. I like romantic comedies. I think you put it really simply, Darren, that it was really very simply about a boy and a girl who fall in love. They come from different walks of life, and he brings her home to meet his family, and that becomes really evident to her. And then the question mark is, will their romance survive or not? I loved how glamorous everybody was. I thought they cast it really well, and the guy, the director and the costume designer and the guys who do set design and all the sort of paraphernalia that goes around the movie, I think they did such a good job, and they just went all out. They probably just went, look, this is supposed to be about a super glamorous, super rich, uber elite set of people. Let's just give people the fantasy version of this world, and they did exactly that. I really, really loved it. Whether or not it's close to the book, I think by and large it does do that. I know, Darren, we can talk about this later on, whether you can actually sympathise with the lead characters, so Rachel and Nick, particularly Nick. Are they too perfect as characters?
Yeah.
There's a bit of a question mark, and we can go into that a little bit later.
Yeah, we definitely should talk about that. I mean, yeah, when I get into my impressions, absolutely, that was something that, keep going.
The basic story is faithful. There are some changes they made to the plot, and I think it was probably because so this series is a trilogy. There are 2 other books, and the different a few different media outlets have confirmed that they're going to do sequels because of how successful the movie has been. So I think they sort of designed the plot and filming of Crazy Rich Asians with that in mind, because they don't actually spend as much time on developing the characters or the different sort of parallel plots, which, Nick and Rachel, and then there's Astrid and her husband and the other cousins of Nick, Eddie, and there's one other guy, the guy who is going out with the Taiwanese porn star.
Oh, Alistair.
Alistair, that's it. In the book, you get a lot more meat and depth into their actual stories and why they're actually important to the constellation of family members that Nick is part of. And I guess each of them give a different insight into how Asian, that sort of uber rich Asian world is like, or Chinese world is like. So I think that's probably because they had this idea of, well, we've got 2 more movies to explore those, let's just set the world up. Their characters are a little bit simple, and you really only just get a glimpse of them, not really a sense of who they are. The ending is also not exactly the same. So the book is a bit more ambiguous about how Nick and Rachel
Really?
style. Yeah. So in the book, it's a question mark, whereas in the movie, they've gone with the classic romantic plot, which
What
is.
do you mean it's a question mark?
So so the big confrontation is between his mother Eleanor and Rachel when she reveals that she had a private investigator look into her background, and her father is actually not dead. And her father is actually, this is Rachel's father, is actually a politician in the Chinese Communist Party. And incredibly, yeah. And so this sets up this whole other drama and then set of plots that take place in the second book. And that devastates Rachel because, 1, she finds out her dad is actually alive. And then 2, she's thinking about, why didn't my mother tell me? And so she talks about this as a kind of sundering of her trust in him. So then at the end of the book, she, now I can't remember if she actually does make up with him, but it's not in that kind of neat bow that they have on the plane. It's a bit more complicated. And it, I think
correct me if I'm wrong, Maggie, but as I understand it, they get engaged in the second book.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Charles been reading his wiki.
Yeah. You've been preparing.
I know that it's in the first book she does actually go and she wants to go and meet her father.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how it ends. And then she and Nick, I think she reconciles with her mum, and then I think she and Nick make up, but they don't get engaged. And then that's it. And then it moves on to the second book, which is Rachel's past and her family in China.
I mean, that is an interesting choice. And I think, like, when you say that to me, that, like, it does get, I mean, look, we're kind of talking outside of the scope of the film here, but in the second,
exactly, the film is the film.
Yeah. But I mean,
I was just going to say, it's just interesting that for this first film, they thought, right, let's just hook the audiences with glitz and glamour and a classic rom-com, and let the power of the franchise bring people to the table.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what? It sounds like they were betting against the possibility that maybe they'd only have the one movie. And so they thought, if we're only going to have one movie, we better bring the relationship to consummation or fruition at the end of this movie, rather than assume that we're going to get another one to allow them to get engaged in a sequel.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about this before I give my impressions, right? But in my mind, when I look at this film, this was a sure bet at the box office. Their budget was like 30 mil or less, which is like bupkis in Hollywood, right? Like, it's like you get Asian actors, you pay them nothing, and you make a film. Good on you, right? And this book, the book is basic amongst sort of the Chinese diaspora, right? Like, not obviously mainland China or like Chinese people who were living overseas. This book was like a Bible from I heard about it I don't know, 6-7 years ago, and pretty much all all these people I knew who were living in Hong Kong, like Aussies or Americans who had moved back to Hong Kong after they finished their uni or gone back to Taiwan or Singapore or whatever. They were all like, "Oh, you got to read Crazy Rich Asians. It's a huge thing." And my sister of all people was reading it as well, right? So when I thought about it, I was like, man, like in some ways this feels like a surefire thing, right? Like if you
Right.
invest $30 million, it's pretty likely that you'll get enough people to like make your money back on this. And anyway, so I do find it surprising that like they're framing it in like, oh, this is like a surprise hit or whatever it is, right? Because amongst like people that I knew, this was like a well-established franchise, right? Like a well-established book franchise. But anyway, that's kind of like we can talk about that kind of later on.
Mm.
Yeah, so look, I mean, I'm probably not as positive on this film as you guys are. I thought it was a perfectly serviceable romantic comedy, and I'm probably a little bit like Anaja in that I'm not a huge fan of romantic comedies unless Ryan Reynolds is in them.
Oh.
I love The
Oh.
Proposal. I love it. Like he's awesome. Let's be honest. But like I thought it was like a serviceable romantic comedy film. I thought that a lot of the interest was driven by the fact that there is this sort of level of intrigue over how like the sort of ethnic nature of the film, and also that it's kind of like an insight into lives of rich people, right? Which I guess is always kind of a little bit voyeuristic and intriguing. Yeah, so I guess for me, like I kind of felt like a lot of the characters were not particularly well developed. Like I definitely what Mag said earlier about I left that film and I felt that the character of Nick was basically like he was basically a prince who had no faults, right? He was rich.
He's a complete cipher.
Yeah, he's ripped as hell. He's super rich, and he's like so down to earth, right? Doesn't engage in any hijinks on the Bucks. He's just like the perfect man. I mean, I want to marry him, right? Like it's insane. So I kind of felt that, like, you know, character-wise, they kind of outside of Eleanor and I think Rachel. I think Eleanor and Rachel are the most complex characters. But outside of those characters, everyone else is kind of just a caricature, almost, of a rom-com role. So I guess for me that was, you know, if I'm completely honest about, like, if I'm sort of assessing this film with sort of other rom-coms, like I kind of feel like it would have been nice if there was some sort of development with those sorts of characters as well. I think I also really had an issue with logically the central, I guess, like conflict in the film between Eleanor and Rachel. I can kind of understand it, but then like there's one
Really?
point, yeah, like I can kind of get it, but then the one point that really got me, that kind of, and look, maybe I'm just biased towards it, right? But basically, the mother at one point says to Rachel, "You're like Chinese American, you would never understand what it's like for us." And for me, like that was one of the weirdest lines, right? Because really, like, she's not. So basically, the resolution of this film is that Rachel shows Eleanor that, you know, she does understand Eleanor's values, right? But for me, it was a really weird thing for Eleanor to bring up, and a really weird thing to be a central point of conflict, because, like, Rachel Koo is basically, like, she's first generation Chinese, right? So it means that, like, in many ways, like, her mum was an immigrant, right? She still speaks Chinese. So it's not like she's that divorced from that culture. And, you know, like, we're talking about Singaporeans here who are straight up, like, they're part of the Chinese diaspora as well, right? So it feels weird that she would say, "Oh, I'm not accepting you because basically you're part of the Chinese diaspora," when I'm like, hang on, like, take a look at yourself. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So for me, I actually preferred that actually Rachel and Eleanor were not that far apart in terms of cultural diversity. If they'd introduced like a white person or even an Asian who's like second or third generation and clearly very different to Eleanor, I don't think it would have had the same impact, because I actually liked that even though Rachel was so similar, any kind of difference at all. Any kind of not fitting into Eleanor's world was seen as this massive threat to her. Like, she had no flexibility there, and I think that was quite consistent with the person that she was. So I think I preferred that, and it really did play out that story of when you are a first-generation immigrant or close to a first-generation immigrant, there is nowhere for you to really belong. Like, you don't belong in the world you came from, and you don't really belong in the new world either. So I like that aspect of it. I'd like to talk about the things that I liked and I didn't like, but I might just wait for you to sort of finish what your thoughts were, Darren.
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, look, I think really, like, for me, that was, look, I understand where you're coming from, and you're probably right? Like, but for me, when I was watching it, it just seemed really jarring for whatever reason. So, yeah. Yeah, and I guess the other thing that felt a bit jarring for me was the ending, where, like, she spent the entire film basically, sort of not rejecting, but saying, like, basically setting herself completely apart from his kind of world. And then the end scene where they kind of, like, I understand it's a rom-com, which is why they probably need the party scene at the end, but the end scene where she kind of just accepts, like, he's hired out the top floor of the Marina Bay Sands, and, like, they have, like, synchronized swimmers in the pool, right? It just seemed really out of place, right? Because she's portrayed as this ultra down-to-earth lady, and then all of a sudden she's like, okay, fine, party on, right? Whatever. Like, anyway, it's just, there were a lot of little things in the film that kind of, like, I guess just rubbed me the wrong way, right? So, anyway.
So what I loved about it, like, there's some things I really didn't like, and some things that I liked a lot. I liked that it was very female centric. All the really strong and interesting characters in this movie were female, mainly Michelle Yeoh and Constance Wu, but even Awkwafina, Gemma Chan, like, all the ones I cared about, and we did see some character development were female, which was awesome. I liked the whole rich poor thing. So I don't actually feel comfortable or like it when movies fetishize richness and just enormous wealth. It makes me uncomfortable. In this movie, I tried to be good with it because, you know, they did try to do it in a very fun way, and I try to just enjoy the colors and the glitz and so on. But I kind of like that in the very opening scene where, so what happens is, you know, the Michelle Yeoh's family walk into the hotel. They're treated like dirt by the people who work in the hotel. What do? They buy the hotel. And I like that they kind of communicated the message that, look, money is a way for people to exert power over other people, and if you're being treated like crap, you can turn that around through wealth, because it is the great equalizer. No matter what you have, if I've got more money than you, then I've got power over you. Now, I didn't like that message, but I found it an interesting one. I'm not sure that they were really trying to say that. I think they were just trying to do something funny, but I found that quite interesting. And then throughout the movie, it's all about rich, like how important it is to be rich, how powerful you are, how everybody wants to know you, everybody wants to be you if you're rich, and how other people have to try to win your approval if you're rich. And, you know, Rachel, the character of Rachel, spends the entire movie trying to win the approval of these people. She has to play by their game. You know, even to prove that she's good enough, she has to show that she can play their game before she can say that she's good enough, which all of that sucks, right? But I did like that at the end. I loved that it came down to that mahjong game, and I loved that what happened in mahjong completely mirrored what Rachel was doing, which is to say that, you know, at the end of the day, I, who have nothing, I, this poor person with no family, no important family to speak of, I am the reason that you will feel happiness in your life. I have all the power. I can take away everything that means something to you, or I can give you the greatest joy and make your dreams come true. I have that power, and I will choose to give it to you. So, you know, in the mahjong game, Rachel has the winning hand. but she allows she allows Eleanor to win. And then at the end, she turns over her hand, and Eleanor can see, wow, she could have beat me if she wanted to. So I love that in the end, the message is ultimately love is much more powerful than all the wealth and money in the world. So I really love that part of it. I loved the Astrid storyline. So I actually think it was wonderful to see, like, I could really relate to Astrid's husband and how hard it must have been to feel like you didn't matter and nothing you did matter because nothing you did mattered because your perfect wife was the only thing that mattered. And you couldn't even really get angry with her because she was perfect and she's always supporting you and she's just the model of perfection. And I could relate to how frustrating that must have been for him. But then when he goes and he has this affair and she finds out about it, he's a complete asshole about it, and at no point does he take any real responsibility for it. And so I loved seeing her stand up to him at the end and say, you know what, I don't apologize for my wealth. You know, I chose you. You had nothing. I chose you, and you should have been man enough to see your own worth. And it's not, you know, I can't give that to you if you don't have it yourself. And so that's kind of why I was okay with Rachel's character being all right with the wealth in the end, because at the end of the day, if you love someone who's rich and that richness is part of their life, then you do actually have to embrace it and find some comfort, you know, in that, even if it's not really your own thing, if you're going to make both of your worlds sort of work together. So that was cool. I loved, look, when it started to end, towards the end, when Nick goes after Rachel in the airport scene, hated it. I thought, why are we going back to this usual romantic comedy trope bullshit? This movie is better than that. Why are we ending on this way? But I did love it when he proposes to her for the second time and he shows her the ring. And I just thought, wow, like I cried in that moment. And I wasn't crying for Rachel and Nick. I was crying for Rachel and Eleanor and like the journey that Eleanor had gone through and the sacrifice that both of those women had chosen to make, and you know the way that both of those women had grown. All of that was just shown in that ring, and I just thought that was like so moving. Yeah, I just think that was a really intelligent way of doing it, and it was fantastic. So just going to what I didn't like Nick Young. I did not think he was the perfect boyfriend. I thought he was a total loser.
Really?
Why did he not prepare Rachel for the family? Like, why didn't he take better steps to sort of protect her from that? And what the hell at the end? I realized that he chooses Rachel, but then he so easily just goes back to his own world and needs his mother to come along and give him her approval before he can go back to her. So I thought he was a massive loser. That would not have worked for me one bit. Okay, not my guy. I didn't like the last thing I didn't like. Look, guys, this is Singapore, right? There are brown people in Singapore. I'm brown myself. I did not like that the only two brown people in this movie were the guards, and they didn't even portray them like real human beings. They were kind of lurking around like these comedic animals, and I thought that really sucked. Okay, so especially because this is Singapore, it's not like it's set in China or anything. So a little bit more representation for the brown folks, please. And those are my thoughts.
So I would actually agree with you in terms of a lot of, like, pretty much all the points that you thought were strong points of the film, I would also agree with, right? Like, I thought that the end airport scene was redeemed by the ring. Like, I thought the ring was a really clever touch, right? Like, I mean, yeah, so I thought, you know, that was kind of like a great scene. I also agree that the film basically... The points where I liked the film the most basically was the point when they were playing mahjong. Right? I thought that mahjong scene was pretty
amazing.
Yeah, very well filmed, right? And I thought it was full of symbolism and depth. And Mags will know though that I immediately complained because, like, I felt like they broke mahjong protocol. And
But when she shows her hand, is that when you thought they broke protocol?
No. I mean, we can talk about this a little bit, but from a resonance perspective, the whole mahjong thing personally has a lot of resonance with me, right? Because my mum taught me how to play mahjong as well, and like that idea of learning life lessons from mahjong was also something that my mum iterated. But
Wow.
the key point was for me was that what Rachel did, bring the tile into her hand, is like disqualification, right? Like if you bring the tile to anyway, you can't do that. And then afterwards, Eleanor winning the hand by putting the tile into her thing, the way my mom taught me, that would have been in Taiwanese mahjong parlors, you would have been kicked out, or you would have just lost all your money immediately, right? But anyway, I don't know if that's just my mom's rules or whatever, but
Daz, we're just a bit more straight in the Malay Peninsula. You just got to be, we're just a bit rougher, we're just a bit tougher.
But yeah, like, look, so I agreed with all those points. But for me, I guess some of this stuff was so close to home that I started really, like, nitpicking some of the details. And I said this to Mags, and Mags was kind of like, that's got nothing to do with the movie. And I completely acknowledge that. But it's kind of like, it just irks me, right? I don't
Gerald
know why.
had similar issues. Things that have really nothing to do with anything, but really irked him.
So, Jerry, tell me about the stuff that irked you, buddy.
The thing that really, really, really irked me, and it's not small, is Henry Golding. Henry Golding is so obviously not Chinese. You just look at him.
He's a halfie, right? He's a halfie. He's a halfie for sure.
Yeah,
If he's a halfie, he's Chinese.
No, but he's not even he's not even half Chinese.
Yeah.
He's half English, half Malay. So you look at him and you can tell straight away he's not Chinese. And the idea that they couldn't find a Chinese bloke good looking enough to play a supposedly good looking Chinese bloke is ridiculous.
You would
Mate,
be
Jerry,
the K. You've had a number of cases on. Right?
Jerry, let me ask you a question. How many jacked Chinese kids do we have in our year at school?
Yeah, look, can I just say...
I wish I was that jacked. I'm not.
Our school was particularly lacking in jacked people, Chinese and non-Chinese.
That's true.
I mean,
that's true.
We were
generally
unique
just
in that regard.
Yeah.
But the thing is, look, the bloke who plays the groom, Colin, Chris Pang. Chris Pang is Australian-born. He's Chinese. He mastered the English accent. He's pretty ripped. He's pretty good-looking. I don't understand why he couldn't play Nick Young. And the story that's being spun by the makers of the movie is we chose Henry Golding because he was the only person we could find who could pull off that sort of upper-class British accent, which is bullshit because Chris Pang pulled it off in playing Colin. So I just found that completely and utterly jarring.
Okay.
I thought he had an Aussie accent, actually.
Yeah, I felt like he had an Aussie accent as well. I thought you could tell the Aussie underlying the British accent. Yeah.
Maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, because Max immediately turned around to me and was like, "That guy's Australian, right?" I was like, "Yeah, he sounds kind of Australian." Yeah.
Maybe.
But you're right. He was equally as good looking and equally as jacked.
He was not. Come on, you guys need to get. He was not as jacked as Golding.
Truth be told, the bloke who plays Astrid's husband, Michael,
also very jacked.
Henry Golding.
Also very jacked.
No, he was more ripped. Okay, sorry. Let's. There's a difference between jacked and ripped, but anyway.
So there's that, right? And there's the fact that what also irked me was the fact that only one character spoke with the proper Hokkien-inflected Malay Chinese accent, and that's Awkwafina's mum.
Thank you so much.
That particularly sing-songy accent that's characteristic of Chinese people living in the Malay Peninsula. Everyone else spoke, the Queen's English.
Yeah, because Michelle Yeoh doesn't speak with a Singlish accent, right? Like she's.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a bit of it there because she was born in Ipoh in Malaysia, so there's still a bit of it there. But she spent so much time in Hong Kong that there's a heavy overlay of other stuff on top of her accent. But you can still hear a bit of at the bottom. But there's only one character who speaks in the proper Singlish accent, and she's played for laughs.
Yeah.
Whereas everyone else speaks the Queen's English and is sort of less broadly comic than her, with the exception, of course, of Ken Jeong, because Ken Jeong is doing his usual Ken Jeong thing.
Yeah, Ken Jeong. Yeah, exactly, right? Ken Jeong was, like, felt
So
kind of out of place. Did you not feel that?
yeah, no, he was completely out of place, particularly since he was meant to be a native.
Yeah.
And as Anna just said, there is something weird about the extent to which the multi-ethnic nature of Singaporean society got absolute short shrift in this movie. Um, you know, uh, the the fact of the matter is, Singapore has had Chinese prime ministers all throughout, but it's had at least one Tamil Indian president, and it is a very, very successful multi-ethnic society. There are Malays, Indians, Chinese, and others in this melting pot on the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. It's certainly more successful a multi-ethnic society than even Malaysia, which practices a very, very rigid form of discrimination by excluding Chinese people, say, from all government jobs and from the political system, with the slight exception of the Malay Chinese Association. So given all that, one would have thought that this movie would celebrate the multiracial success of Singapore more than it did, because in fact it didn't at all. So there are those things which kind of irked me about its portrayal of Singapore, and the fact that people tended to speak Mandarin or Cantonese, whereas Hokkien was sort of seen as something a bit lower class. At the mahjong parlor, the two other women at the table are said to be women who speak only Hokkien, therefore can't understand the conversation between Michelle Yeoh and Constance Wu. And this idea that and underlying that, and maybe there's a hint of truth about it, is that sort of Hokkien people are a bit rougher, a bit less educated, a bit more uncouth. And, being Hokkien myself, that kind of irked me as well.
Okay, look, before we open the floodgates on cultural details, because I'm ready to offload as well, right? But before we open those floodgates, do we have anything else to say about kind of the film in general? I think the general consensus is that it was like a fun rom-com, and I think you guys probably liked it more than me and thought it was quite a good romantic comedy. Look, to be honest, I think you guys are probably right. I think I'm judging it through a lens that a slightly different lens. Yeah.
I think Michelle Yeoh carries this. Look, I love Constance Wu, who plays Rachel. She's this breakout star of Fresh Off the Boat. I love her so much. But Michelle Yeoh is just fantastic. Like the dimension and the depth she gives to the character of Eleanor, and the stateliness. Like, she's not a villain by any means, right? She could so easily be a cartoon character, evil stepmother, mother-in-law type, and look, I just think she brings so much more to it than any kind of stereotype like that. And you can't help but feel for her and respect her, despite all the not so lovely things that she does. So I think she really made the film.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think part of it was with Rachel. She's actually given... I think they're given more opportunity than any of the other characters to actually be developed in the film. Just because, the rest of the movie is really about setting the scene, painting that society. So in the book, and I keep comparing it to it, and funnily enough, the mahjong scene is not in the book.
Oh, wow.
So I think it's quite interesting that they decided to use that as the way of differentiating the movie from the book. You do get a greater sense of the history of Eleanor and where she's coming from. And Rachel's almost used as this sort of chance to give a diaspora lens into, this this other Asian world that she thought that she was a part of, but actually quite different from. And actually is meant to act as a counterpoint against, the sort of girls that she meets in Nick's circle when he grew up in Singapore. So it's interesting that I think they tried to keep that with the character in the movie as well. But it was probably just reflecting on what you were saying, Anaja. a bit challenging because they're also trying to pull in, all the sort of other rom-com devices, like, she changes from being the sort of dorky-looking ordinary girl into, she has the makeover to look like a princess so that she can go to the
ball.
She can go to the ball, and then she meets the, potentially evil stepmother, all those sorts of steps. So I think they struggled a little bit with that, but I think at the end they recovered themselves on it.
Yeah. I've got to look. I mean, I'm being harsh on it. It's like it's a solid romantic comedy, right? Like it does everything that a romantic comedy kind of needs to do, and I think the
It's
central.
better than your average, right? Romantic comedy's crap.
Yeah. And look,
Better than your
to be
average.
honest, like Anaja's right in that, when you were talking about it just then, Anaja, you're right. Like that central conflict, if I'm able to put my personal prejudices aside and my nitpicky aside, that central conflict between Eleanor and Rachel is kind of understandable and believable and relatable, even if the background of crazy richness is not necessarily particularly relatable. So yeah, like, look, you guys are right? There's a humanist undertone to it. Like when you rip away the crazy richness aspect, there's a human undertone to it, which I think is identifiable by pretty much, well, relatable to pretty much everyone, right? So in that sense, I think it's a successful romantic comedy. Yeah. It was interesting though, because you're right. I didn't feel like Eleanor was really necessarily a villain. I actually thought that the grandma was probably the most villainous out of all of them, right?
Oh yeah, and she kind of niggles at Eleanor the whole time.
Yeah, like she's a total total bitch to her, because Eleanor, it's basically implied that she's dedicated her life to the family, right? So, and then for the grandma to still be like that nitpicky, and it was just, and then like right at the end when the grandma shows her true face, which is kind of like, she says to Rachel, you can't be a part of this family, bugger off, sort of thing, right? It was just like, it felt like it was villainous, because she was so like, she'd hidden it.
She lured her in.
Yeah,
with her niceness, and then she turned like that.
Yeah, and at least
Not only that, Jazz, but you'll recall that at one point Eleanor makes reference to the fact that she allowed Nick basically to be raised by his grandmother.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons, one of which is that he would therefore have a better shot at inheriting everything.
Yeah.
But the idea that you would allow this other woman to raise your child, and she still shits on you at every opportunity, would tend to suggest that this grandmother is a bitch. Like, she's a total bitch.
Yeah. And Mags was...
Oh, no, you go, Darren.
Well, you were saying to me that the way the grandmother is described in the book is very different from the way she is portrayed. Because in this movie, she's portrayed as... The reason why you're kind of drawn into it is because she's portrayed as a little old lady, right? She's kind of frail, she needs attendance, that sort of thing. And that's kind of why you think to yourself, oh, she's just like a nice old woman, right? But then Mags was saying to me that in the book, she's actually portrayed as very differently, right?
Well, she and all the aunties are actually portrayed very differently. So the aunties, except for, I think it's Auntie Alex, are meant to be... So Auntie Alex, I think, is meant to be the frumpy one who wears, your classic... older Asian mother look of the 30-year-old pants with the elastic waist, and she has her hair tied up, and her furniture's all covered with plastic, and they haven't got shoes for like 20 years because she believes in being frugal, and that's part of the reason, putting everything into her portfolio so that she has this nest egg for her children to draw on and her grandchildren to draw on when she moves on. So and sort of all the other aunties are in that vein, and they all speak with the Singaporean accent. And the great grandmother is actually portrayed as the kind of tiger matriarch, the woman who holds all the family together. She's slender, she's stately, she dresses in silks that she had made when she was in her 20s. The two attendants are meant to be from the royal court of the Thai king, two courtesans, which he promised, the Thai king promise would always be she would always have 2 Thai courtesans in attendance, and the guards out front are actually meant to be well, not burkas. What are they called
Gurkhas, they're
again?
Gurkhas.
Gurkhas. Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
like stuck with
yeah.
something ends with urkas. Yeah, so like it's meant to portray this woman who actually grew up in a completely different time, sort
A
of.
queen.
Yeah, she grew up at a time where her friends were actually princesses and princes. Um, People lived on huge estates. They went hunting. Um, and it was only during World War II that all of that was stripped from her. And one of the reasons why she's she's meant to be fiercely proud of her heritage and of her family because of that lineage, but also because of her ability to survive during that point in time. So the books go in a little bit about how her family was broken apart during World War II, what happened to her brothers, and what she had to do during that time. So the movie doesn't give you the opportunity to explore that depth. I think that's probably one of the reasons why I'm a bit more sympathetic.
Right.
Yeah, but I think in this movie, they used her as a sort of foil almost to, well, what's the reason for Rachel? Rachel has to run away at some point in time in this movie, so there's conflict.
And it creates sympathy for Eleanor as well, right? Where she's under the thumb of this, like, even more dominant, oppressive force. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So shall we talk briefly, kind of, look, I mean, Gerald kind of just touched on this. So I think at this point we'll kind of stop talking about the movie, and we'll probably just talk about our own sort of cultural resonance with this film, right? So Gerald kind of opened fire a little bit earlier by saying that there are a few little touches like, the Hokkien, etc., that kind of didn't feel quite right in this film. I definitely would like to add to that. So firstly, like, some of the Chinese is really bad. Like, uh, like, I think Rachel's Chinese is definitely not good, and I
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I mean, it's been a long time since I last had the ability to speak Mandarin, and even to my ear, it sounded a bit off.
Yeah. It definitely was off. And there were a few, look, and you mentioned this, right? Where it's kind of like, there are moments when you kind of feel like people should be speaking Singlish and they're not speaking in that accent. And there were moments when people were speaking Chinese and they were speaking in the wrong Chinese accent. So, again, it's this tiny detail, but it was just kind of like, if you're making an Asian movie that you know that Asian people, like Chinese people specifically, right, are going to be watching this and like sort of nitpicking on it, when you go to Taiwan, wouldn't you get someone who speaks Taiwanese Mandarin instead of someone who like really blatantly speaks with, I think anyway, a pretty strong sort of Beijing or sort of mainland Chinese accent? It's just like really weird stuff. Which is kind of like, hang on, like it's kind of like, the audience is going to be aware of this stuff, right? So why wouldn't you really kind of do something about that? Yeah. Um, what was the other thing that kind of
Daz, while you're on the topic of Singlish, what was interesting to me was that in the opening scenes of the film, when you see Rachel and Nick at the bar and that woman walks past, and you see this big WeChat chat that covers the globe about Nick and his new girlfriend. The funny thing is, people texted in Singlish, so they ended their sentences with "la." Someone says "alamat" at one point, and then
Yeah.
someone else says "ayo," and so these are classic Singlish expressions that are texted, but not one of them is uttered during the runtime of the film.
Yeah. It's interesting like that, and in some ways, I know that the film's title is Crazy Rich Asians, which is like catchy, right? It's a catchy title, but in some ways, this film should actually be renamed Crazy Rich Chinese Diaspora, because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not really about Asians in general. It's about a very specific subset of Asians, which is Chinese diaspora, right? Like, it's not really about mainland Chinese people. It's not really about like local Taiwanese or local Hong Kongers or Koreans or Japanese people or Indians or like Sri Lankans or like Pakistanis, right? Like it's not really about that. It's actually really focused on like Chinese people, like people of Chinese ethnicity who kind of live in the broader sort of Asian sphere kind of thing,
On
right?
on the Singlish note, or is that what you call it, Gerald? I've never heard that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that sing-song accent, is that what you're talking about?
No, no, it's some of the expressions as well.
Okay, I just wonder if the reason that they didn't go for that is kind of similar to why the whole soundtrack, it's done in Chinese, some kind of dialect in Chinese, but it's all Western songs, right?
Yes.
They've taken Western. So I think they've done that, all these things for the same reason, which is that they want it to be fully Asian, but they also want the Westerners to be able to connect with it. So I think that might be why they've made some of those choices.
Yeah, look, I think I think the filmmakers know that this is a film that is targeted towards the Chinese diaspora, right? Rather than
But they do want it to influence and for it to be valued by and enjoyed by, white people as well. I think they wanted that, right? They
yes,
didn't
Yeah.
just want to make a film for Chinese people.
I think Anage is absolutely right, and there's a story about the making of this movie that's probably sort of helpful to know, and that is that Kevin Kwan, the bloke who wrote the book, and John M. Chu, the director of the movie, were offered a shit ton of money by Netflix to develop Crazy Rich Asians and the sequels as Netflix properties. So they had a deal for, I think, 3 or 4 movies. They were both going to rake in a ton of money, but the catch was that this movie was not going to make it onto the big screen. It was going to be a Netflix property, so you actually had to seek it out or have it recommended to you by the Netflix algorithm. Both of them turned down that deal, notwithstanding that it was really lucrative, because they thought it was necessary 25 years after the Joy Luck Club to have Asian Americans or Asians on the big screen. And they said, look, if we take this money now, we are going to be right back where we were before, namely with Asians not on the big screen, not being seen by white middle America. So it was part of the mission of the movie, I think, when you know that, is to sell the Asian experience or to present the Asian experience to white America. So whilst it has definitely one foot in the camp of the Chinese diaspora, more broadly still, it was a movie pitched to, moviegoers in Cincinnati, or at least white moviegoers in the coastal regions of the United States. They very much wanted this to be seen in cinemas by as broad a range of people as possible.
Yeah, look, I would agree with that, right? Because when I think about, I think this film probably speaks to people like myself, Mags, Jerry more because we are Chinese, specifically Chinese diaspora, right? But I can also see that if you were a mainland Chinese person and you watch this film, it would probably not be as impactful, right? Because as Chinese diaspora, you're used to living in a world where you're the minority, right? Like, I hate using that word, but like the reality is that there's fewer Chinese people here than white people or wherever it is, right? So,
Are you tapping, Darren?
no, I don't think so.
Oh, there's like a tapping when you're talking. Go on.
Yeah. But yeah, so, I guess there would be a greater resonance with, Chinese diaspora, right? But if you were sitting in mainland China, I don't actually think this would be really that much of a watershed film at all. Because, the reality is that, like, you've got the Hong Kong film industry, you have the, like, Chinese film industry. They see Asians on film, like, every day of the week, right? It's not that big of a deal. And so, like, if you viewed it through that lens, it's basically just like, well, this is just another romantic comedy about rich overseas Chinese people. And, like, all Asians kind of, like, are a little bit judgy, right? Let's be honest, right? Asians are super judgy of each other, right? So they're probably thinking, oh, these, like, diaspora people, whatever, I don't care. So it's just, Yeah, I think Jerry is right. The significance of this film is for um, it's a film that's made, I think, for white audiences to kind of expose white audiences to sort of the wider Chinese diaspora. But it's also a film that's made for the Chinese diaspora audience to kind of as like a sort of a self-reflective sort of film, right? So, yeah.
And it's made for us. It's made for minorities who live in Western countries who don't get to see people who look like us on the screen.
Mm, mm, mm. That's fair. So yeah, I mean, I think yeah. So I'd be very interested actually in seeing how this film actually does in mainland China because obviously that's a huge market, right? But um, yeah, I think it's done very well in the States, but I'm not sure how it will actually do in like sort of properly established Asian markets who see Asian people on screen 24/7, basically. So. Um,
Mm.
yeah. Um, so I kind of wanted to talk about like just very quickly, just like any scenes that really resonated with you, like with you guys personally. I mean, I'll start. I think the scene that really, I guess, that really resonated with me was absolutely the mahjong scene because,
Mm.
as I said, um, like my mum taught me mahjong as well, right? And it was kind of this weird moment where, because I remember I used to like sort of argue with my mum about mahjong, right? Because I always saw it as well, it's actually a form of gambling, and so why do you love playing this game? And then I remember like I sat down with her and I sort of learned how to play this game with her, right? And basically she said to me kind of like it's not exactly what they said in the film, but basically she was saying to me that mahjong builds your character because it teaches you that there are times when you win and there are times when you lose, and you need to learn how to win and you need to learn how to lose as well, right? And it's kind of like,
Mm.
in mahjong they have like the four wins, they've got the four win tiles, and you kind of need to um, you need to learn how to live under each of the four winds, essentially, right? So,
Mhm.
like that scene when Rachel is talking to Eleanor and is having that moment about the mahjong, I was like, yeah, okay, I really get that. And I think also the character of Eleanor kind of resonates with me as well because I feel that there are a lot of Chinese mothers that kind of have like have aspects of Eleanor, right? I mean, I'm not like there were definitely aspects of my mum that I could see sort of like reflected in the character that Michelle Yeoh was playing as well. And so I felt like for me those things had sort of particular resonance with me as like I guess a Chinese Australian, right, who was watching the film. Um, Jerry, Mags, um, Andrew, did you guys
Look,
feel
I've
that?
got to, on that note, I've got to say I can kind of relate to what you're saying, Darren, in that I can sort of, yeah, I think with Gerald's mum or my mother-in-law, I can also see elements of Eleanor, and it's probably why I feel the way about Eleanor that I do. That you can see all those elements that can be so challenging at times, and yet you've got so much reason to respect that person because you can also see, what she's done, what she's built, how strong and incredibly resilient she is, how much courage she has. You can see what makes her such a powerful, strong woman, and it's impossible not to be able to respect that. So yeah, maybe that is a very typical Chinese mum kind of quality.
Yeah, the things that resonate with me about this movie, despite the minor criticisms that I lodged against it a bit earlier, really come out of the fact that whilst there is now a burgeoning Chinese film industry, and there's long been a very successful Hong Kong film industry, there's actually not been very much for those of us in the Chinese diaspora who hail from the Malay Peninsula. And so, jokingly I say that never in my life would I have expected to see a mainstream Hollywood film in which the word kukujiao is used, and not just used, but chanted by a crowd, not just a crowd, but a crowd of bikini-clad beauty queens, the word kukujiao being, of course, Hokkien Malay for dick. But to hear that word presented a momentary shock of recognition. And not because it was particularly deep, but like I said, for someone whose family
Gerald,
hailed from
that's
the
the top residents. They shouted dick at the top of their voices.
no,
But it
but they
wasn't
shouted.
even that deep.
They shouted dick in my lingo, people. And so that's absolutely a trivial example. I mean, the scenes of Singapore, of the Singapore food market, the scenes of the kitchen where the local cakes, otherwise known as square, are being made, were just sort of brought back to me large parts of my childhood. During the first ball that Rachel attends, and when she first meets Eleanor, there is at one point playing over the crowd an old Mandarin pop song. I don't know whether it hails from Taiwan, but it was certainly played a lot in parts of Malaysia and Singapore, called Tian Mimi, and that was a song that my father played a lot, and I hadn't heard that song in about 20 years, and to hear it playing in this scene was striking, and if not wholly emotional, at least sort of carried with it the promise of some connectedness with the characters of this film. So I won't say that. I'll say this, Daz. I'm probably more of a banana than you. I can't speak Mandarin. I can understand a fair amount of Hokkien, but I'm certainly not conversational. And my mother, who knows how to play mahjong, never taught me how to play the game. Probably because she wasn't much good at it. And so some part of the world of this movie is lost in me, but it bears enough of a resemblance to the world that my family came from, namely Malaysia, that even in some trivial details, which were got strikingly right, there were resonances, and it's powerfully weird to sit in a cinema with a whole bunch of other people, a cinema where so often you're being treated to stories that have nothing to do with the world you came from, and to realize that here's this thing that is born, that has its genesis in an experience not too dissimilar from yours. It really is a powerfully unique experience, and certainly nothing that I've encountered before in a movie theater. And so for that reason alone, I think, as I said before, it's hard for me to judge the movie as a movie separate from the resonances that it carries. And that's partly one reason why.
Look, that's true, right? And if I'm generous about this film, I definitely felt what you felt as well, as in there is something quite uplifting to see something that I guess, even like obliquely as part of your culture, it's kind of celebrated on the screen. Yeah. Look, I won't lie. There are definitely moments in this film like where, look, I mean, I think I'm overly critical on it simply because I'm trying to overcompensate for the resonant aspects of it, right? So, yeah. Mags, like.
No, I don't think I have anything further, too much more to add, really. I agree with you and Ananja about, there are things about the Eleanor character that really strike home about my experience with my mum and with my aunties. And I, also, heard from the experiences from my friends who grew up with Chinese mothers as well. And then also what Gerald was saying about parts of the movie that just hit home about, I'm Malaysian Chinese. Even the word gugu jiao, I was like, oh, that was unexpected. That's true, actually. But like I loved the Singapore market scene at the beginning when Rachel comes visit Singapore and they immediately go and they hit up. Their way of showing her the best of Singapore was actually to go and eat, 16 different meals all in one sitting. And that's absolutely true of what my cousins do when we go and visit them. All those little bits and pieces added to the kind of color and life and the scent of the movie. I I absolutely loved the fact that the director and the producer and the writer pitched this as a Hollywood movie. They were unabashed about it. Why not? And why not try and market something to the diaspora Chinese as well? They've got a big hip pocket now that they could spend with, and they also have enough history, I guess, in all the different parts of the world where the Chinese have migrated to actually hook a story onto. So I think it's sort of a really relevant kind of story to have right now. I think that's why it's successful.
I also agree with you, Darren, that the mahjong and the ring reveal, which are really two connected kind of parts of the story, were my favorite. But I just want to give a shout out to that part where Astrid confronts her husband and kind of tells him to get stuffed, because what I loved about that is that you have a strong, powerful woman who decides that she doesn't have to apologize for being strong and powerful, and she doesn't have to apologize for being more successful than her husband. And if her husband isn't man enough to handle that, then yeah, that's not Astrid's problem.
I agree with
love that.
There was a
That's
moment
true.
in that film when I thought she was going to take him back or be like, "Don't leave me." I was like, "Please don't do that." Like that would be outrageous, right? But thankfully, she kicked him to the curb because he was a total prick. And look, can I just say, Gerald made the point that they hired Henry Golding, was that his name? What's his name?
Yeah,
Henry Golding.
yeah, Henry Golding.
Because he was the only one who carried the British accent. But, what accent was the guy? Because the guy who was supposed to play a captain in the Singaporean army did not have a Singaporean accent. He was like, I didn't know where he came from, right?
I think he's Singaporean, the actor.
Is he? Because
Yeah.
his accent doesn't feel like the sort of... Look, maybe I'm being stereotypical of this Singaporean accent.
Did you guys stick around after the credits started rolling to see the little bit at the end?
No, what was a little bit at the end?
Okay, it's just Gerald and I think it might be a hint as to the second movie, but it kind of ends with Astrid at a party, and there's this hot guy at the party, and they're kind of making eyes at each other, and it just comes and it ends.
Oh, this is
so
the
we
one
think
with the
maybe
Glee
it's a
guy,
setup.
right?
That's right. And this isn't just a hot guy. This is Harry Shum Jr. This is
Chinese.
this is the dancing guy from
He
Glee.
can dance. He's like the dancing guy. Yeah.
Gerald, is he Chinese?
Fucked if I know. All my outrage was exhausted by Golden, so I couldn't focus on this bloke.
He looks Chinese. I don't think he's a halfie, right? But he looks definitely pretty Chinese.
He looks a damn sight more Chinese than Henry Golding.
Yes.
Yeah.
We did see that. Yes.
Can we also just talk about how much male topless nudity there was? There was so much male toplessness. It was outrageous.
Yes, I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
Why?
I'm all for a movie that finally recognizes the pure hotness of Asian males.
Yeah, why not?
Oh,
The incandescent hotness of Asian masculinity.
yeah, Jerry.
And the lights-
Jerry.
Gerald's taking his shirt off as of
Yeah, exactly. He's looking himself in the mirror.
Swirling it around.
Yeah, sort of.
As
I don't know.
manager's
Sort of
face.
let me flex my muscles as I twirl my glasses in my hand and solve a maths problem.
Can I note, none of those guys wore...
Or
Did any of those guys wear glasses? I don't think
No,
any-
no.
none of those guys
No,
wore
no.
glasses.
They don't. They had their contacts in, Darren. That's
No,
what
no,
you.
One guy wore glasses, and that was Douchey Bernard.
Oh, and the okay, the one guy that I was like, okay, that's the kind of Chinese guy that I know very well, that I went to school with basically, and was basically me. like the brother of her friend.
Aquafina's brother, Peglin's brother.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
Peglin's brother.
come on.
I was like,
He
okay.
freaking was.
I went to school with it. That was me in high school. I see ya. I see ya.
Do we need to talk about something, Dan, offline? Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're on your own. You're on your own there, Daz. I was nothing.
Mm. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys, for a enjoyable podcast as usual. I think we've exhausted everything we can talk about relating to Crazy Rich Asians. Next week, hopefully, are we going to be back to talk about Counterpart? Are we going to
Yeah,
finish
let's
off
do it.
Counterpart? Yep. So stay tuned next week for our podcast on the second half of Counterpart Season 1. It's been a long time, but we've all finally finished watching Counterpart, so we'll talk about that next week. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me tonight, and I'll see everybody next week.
Okay, see you later.
Thanks. Bye.